Hello everyone and welcome to our second Ideas Fund webinar. My name is Roisin and I manage Northwest Community Network, and we are one of the development coordinators for the Northwest Northern Ireland region, which for all our locals is Derry and Strabane. So I'm introducing our webinar today. We're focusing on mental well-being, which as many of you will know is a key focus for the Ideas Fund. The previous session introduced the fund, and today's session will provide you with some different perspectives about mental well-being. And again, we will be hearing from examples of when communities and researchers have worked together. The previous webinar, if you haven't seen it, is on the British Science Association's YouTube channel and also on the Ideas Fund website. So also just a wee reminder about our additional local workshops taking place next week. We will be sharing the dates at the end of the webinar, and a link to register for the local workshops will be sent out early next week. We also shared a reflection sheet after the last session to help you think through what you heard and I suppose how this might relate to your project and your ideas. So we will be doing the same after this webinar too. So I'm just going to run through what we're going to cover today, an update from the BSA about progress with the fund so far, the levels of interest and some of the key questions and answers that have come across the different workshops and through all of the conversations that we've been having. We will have a discussion on some of the themes and the research happening around what well-being means, and this will be followed by a panel discussion with a few guests sharing their perspectives on how communities and researchers can work together to explore mental well-being. We'll again finish up with some time for question and answer, so if you want to ask questions of our speakers, please do note these in the Q&A box and the chat box. And if there are lots of questions, we'll prioritise the ones for our speakers so we can make sure they have a chance to respond. If we do run out of time, the BSA will pick up all the questions related to the fund afterwards. So delighted to be here this afternoon. And I think for me, there's been lots of great ideas coming through from the Derry and Strabane area. And there's still a few questions around the role of the researcher with communities and how that partnership will work. So I'm going to hand over to Chris from BSA, who's going to talk a bit more about this and a broader update just on the fund so far.
Brilliant. Thank you, Roisin. And hello again to everybody. It's great to see so many on the call. So as we mentioned last time in our webinar, we're committed to being as open and transparent as possible through the delivery of this fund, with the idea that these webinars in a way form part of the application development phase, being geared towards helping you think through your ideas if you're planning to apply. As Roisin mentioned, we just wanted to take a bit of time first to reflect back on what we've been hearing and some of the key questions so far. So the first thing to say is that we've been literally blown away by the level of interest in the Ideas Fund. It's fantastic to see so many people joining today and across both the opening session that we had a couple of weeks ago and the local ones that took place last week. As we discussed last time, we expect to make kind of around 12 to 15 grants through this process in each area. And so, of course, the fund is oversubscribed and is likely to be. But it does seem that the local workshops in particular have provided some space for people to connect with others who are working in similar areas. So hopefully that's helpful in and of itself. As we also said last time, we're open to adapting our approach to the fund if needed and providing some further clarity on the points that come up. And these webinars do give us an opportunity to do that. We've had loads of great questions come through across all of the sessions, and we've tried to answer as many of them as we can throughout. And on that note, just to say that all the questions that we answered that we didn't get to in the session 2 weeks ago, we have answered, and we'll share that out with some other information early next week. There have been two kind of key questions really around eligibility for the fund, which have come up consistently and that we felt would be really useful to take a little bit of time today to answer. The first one is around the role that the researcher could play within your project and what is and isn't eligible. And the second is what the steps will be in supporting you to be linked with the researcher if you don't yet have that connection. So in terms of the first question around the role of the researcher and what that could be, in a sense, given the breadth of ideas and suggestions we've had over the last couple of weeks, it's perhaps easier to start with what isn't eligible. And so I'm going to start and touch on that first before giving some more examples about what could be possible. So the case studies that you would have heard from a couple of weeks ago, and some of those that we'll hear from later on today, will hopefully all give you an idea of how relationships are being built between communities and researchers. And that's a key element of this fund. We'll be looking to support ideas where skills can be built in both directions. So, for example, a community learning research skills with the researcher gaining knowledge from communities that can help inform their wider work, just as an example. Your project is therefore unlikely to be funded if you're only looking to bring a researcher in to deliver a one-off workshop that may feel quite transactional or feels like you're just bringing in a service without that opportunity for longer-term building of a relationship. We're also looking to ensure that relationships are balanced and two-way and equitable. So your project is unlikely to be funded if it's driven by the researcher as a lead. And building on that point, although the fund is about bringing researchers and communities together, and so your project is unlikely to be funded where it's about a researcher coming in and doing research with no two-way interaction or opportunities for the communities to gain skills or knowledge, and or where the communities themselves are purely research participants. This is not a research fund. Researchers have access to those elsewhere. And this fund is really about exploring those benefits of when communities and researchers work together. The final point to say here, and again, I guess kind of building off that last point, is that the funding isn't available just to bring somebody in to evaluate your project. On its own, this is unlikely to bring opportunities for longer term relationships. And again, often these costs can be met with within ongoing project budgets elsewhere. So when you are thinking about your ideas and what you might look to apply for, we'd encourage you to bear these things in mind and also reflect back on the first couple of points I raised are on the slide there. So opportunities to work together and build relationships and skills to be built in both directions. Your development coordinator is available to talk you through your ideas, and we'll let you know if it doesn't seem like a good fit to help you decide whether to apply. At any point, if you realize this funding isn't really geared towards what you feel you need and don't feel like you need to stick with this process, part of this pre-application work is to help you decide whether the fund is right for you, and it may not be for everyone. So in terms of what the role of the researcher could be, we've put a few examples on this slide. As I mentioned, it's probably not helpful to be too definitive on this when we're talking about 100-200 people joining webinars with loads of different ideas and suggestions. And so putting these on screen doesn't necessarily mean that this is what you should aim for. They are just examples intended to give you a sense of what a relationship might look like. So just bear that in mind. For example, it could be about working with a researcher to learn more about or build upon existing research in your area of work or field, and testing or applying some of that research and the learning in your practice or approach. And some of the examples we'll hear from later on will touch on some of that. It could be about helping to translate complex research findings into something that's a bit more meaningful for the people that you work with. And we heard a bit about this from Alma from the Planet BVOC 91 project at the last session. She talked about taking ideas that were important to her as a young person, exploring these by engaging with researchers, and then using them to inform the development of their comic and creative stories in that case. Ideas around working with researchers to develop resources for others could also be eligible. So for example, members of a boxing gym working with sports scientists to develop podcasts or Facebook posts, etc., to share evidence and learning about how to train in a healthy way. Another example might be that you might want to work with a researcher to help you or the people you work with learn more about research skills, knowledge, and methods to take into your work. So we'd encourage you to have a listen back to the case studies from last time and from some of the discussion later today. All of the examples that we're trying to bring forward are just examples, but they do demonstrate some of the things that we've mentioned around opportunities for skills to be built in both directions and the opportunity for longer term relationships. So this brings me on to the second question, which has come up a few times, which is about how you can be linked with a researcher. Some of you may have these links already, which is fantastic, but if you haven't, then that's still no problem. If you'd like to help to be able to do this, please make sure you've contacted your development coordinator so that we can know that you're interested. You will need to have a link with the researcher by the time you apply, but don't forget the application deadline is in May, so there's still time for you to develop this with our support. Don't forget that we also have the opportunity to apply, or you have the opportunity to apply for early stage idea grants for those ideas and partnerships that are really exploratory and not yet fully formed. These sessions and individual conversations are really helping us to build a picture of the types of ideas that people want to work on. In the background, the development coordinators will be sharing this with researchers in your area to help to start to think about where the possibilities might be for people to work together. This is ongoing and it will take some time. It's a bit chicken and egg in a way to try and understand what the level of demand and the types of projects might be, and then match that up with researchers in your area. And we plan to share some more about how we'll approach this at our next webinar in a couple of weeks' time, which is specifically focusing on how communities and researchers might work together. In the meantime, please do stay engaged with this process, as we're hoping it can help you to develop your ideas around what you might want to do. The next step after that, of course, will be to see if that idea can be matched with the researcher's area of interest or expertise, as well as to see if you can work together to define that project idea and something that is of interest to both sides. There aren't any guarantees on that point, of course, and working in this kind of relational way does mean that we might end up with some really great ideas that can't be taken forward because there just isn't a match there. I hope that's helpful. As I said, we've tried to address some of the key questions. If you do have follow-on questions, please do note them down in the Q&A. We'll try and come to them either this afternoon or, as we did last time, collate everything and share it back out so that people can see those questions have been responded to. That's probably quite enough from me for now. So I'll now just hand over to Jill, who's going to move us on and talk a bit more about mental wellbeing in the context of the Ideas Fund.
Lovely, thank you, Chris. So in the Ideas Fund, we've kind of put together quite a specific definition of mental wellbeing for ourselves, and it's as follows. You care about yourself and for yourself. You look after your physical and emotional health by eating well, sleeping well, exercising, connecting with others, and enjoying yourself. You can cope with the stresses of life and you can work productively, whether that's in a job, in education, or through chores and hobbies. So as you can hear, that's quite a holistic definition, because we know that the massively wide range of things define and also contribute to mental wellbeing in individuals and in communities. I think it's important to note, though, that we're clear that this fund is not about funding mental health interventions. So that includes frontline services or really specific therapeutic approaches. So it's not about treating specific diagnoses or mental health conditions. For example, this fund couldn't support the ongoing delivery of a service providing CBT for people with anxiety. However, we could support a wide range of complementary activities, so that could improve mental wellbeing for individuals and the community, kind of in its broader sense, I suppose. So things like physical activity, social activity, being outdoors, maybe taking part in creative activities. The list really could go on and on. Importantly, the ideas should be coming from the community. So what do they think will have an impact on mental wellbeing? For this fund, improved mental wellbeing in the community is really only one part of the picture, and an important outcome is whether projects build stronger relationships between communities and researchers and improve their skills in working with each other. So whatever the idea is to improve mental wellbeing, it's really important that the role of the researcher is a core part of that project. So I'm now going to hand over to Lewis to talk with a couple of our guests a little bit more about different perspectives on mental wellbeing.
Thanks very much, Jill. So hello again, my name is Lewis. I'm one of the development coordinators in Scotland with Science Ceilidh's also supporting these webinars. And as Jill's mentioned, there's lots of different interpretations of what mental well-being can be. And so we wanted to bring a few guests to kind of discuss a broad sense of different perspectives on what's happening in terms of research. A lot of exciting things are happening and developing. So can I invite with us Joanne Smithson, who is the local government and health lead at the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, and also one of our own partners, Dr. Sarah Ann Munoz from the University of Highlands and Islands Division for Rural Health and Wellbeing. Hello to you both. Thank you so much for joining. To kick off our kind of discussion, could you perhaps introduce yourselves and tell us what does mental wellbeing mean to you from your perspective? Could we start with Joanne?
Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and chat to you today. I'm Joanne Smithson, and I'm with the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. So we're the UK's national body for wellbeing evidence, policy and practice. We're one of a network of What Works centres. So one of our other centres is the Centre for Ageing Better. So if you're looking at working with that group of people in your project, I'd really encourage you to have a look at their website too. At the centre, we define wellbeing as how we're doing as individuals, as a community, and as a nation, and how sustainable that is for the future. The important thing about well-being is that it's individual and it's subjective. So we don't know by just looking at people how they're doing. We have to ask and listen really intently. When we measure well-being at the centre, there are 4 areas we look at, because importantly, well-being goes beyond an absence of ill health and pleasant emotions. It's about having a sense of purpose and fulfillment in our lives as well. So when we measure well-being, we talk about how satisfied we are with our lives, how happy we are, how anxious we are, and to what extent do we feel the things we do in our lives are worthwhile.
Thanks, Joanne. And I think that importance of listening really is informed why I know we keep stressing it has to be community led, and I think that's one of the main reasons why the Ideas Fund has developed and why we think these partnerships are so important. And that's a really broad sense of well-being as well. Perhaps would you like to introduce yourself, Sarah Ann, and what does mental well-being mean to you?
Yeah, thanks, Lewis. I'm Sarah Ann Munoz. I'm a researcher. I'm based at the University of the Highlands and Islands in Inverness in the north of Scotland. And so I lead the Division of Rural Health and Wellbeing. We're a research team working in the social sciences. My background is health geography. So I'm interested in understanding what the relationships are between health and place, and the different spaces that we use as individuals in our everyday lives. So I think I've mostly been involved in projects in the rural context, and we generally consider well-being at that individual level. And I think similarly to the definitions that Joanne works with, health geographers would see well-being as much more than just the absence of physical or mental illness. And kind of the phrase that sticks with me from health geography is that it's about having the capacity, but also the freedom to live the life that you want to live, and to be able to do that well.
Thanks, Sarah Ann. And I think that really holistic approach is very much informing, why we're not including necessarily mental health conditions within the Ideas Fund. That's why we are looking at that broader sense, which is really, really interesting. Now, I know there's a lot going on, both in communities and research around mental well-being, of course, given that it's currently the pandemic, it's on a lot of people's minds in lots of different ways. So maybe just to give a broad sense of what kind of things are going on and what excites you would be really nice for people listening in. Joanne?
Yeah, so for me, one of the most important pieces of work that we're doing is understanding who's at risk from low well-being. So who are those groups that we really want to be working with to improve their quality of life? We know that well-being really affects people who have poor health, so poor physical and mental health. We know it affects people who are single and living on their own, people who are renting an accommodation, people with low levels of education as well. But also it affects us across our life course. So we know that well-being is a U-shaped curve, and the bottom of that U-shape is where we're 40 and when we're 48 years old. So for me, I can say, yay, life is soon going to get better. But it's really important that we understand the importance of working age. There's a lot going on for people of working age. They often have caring responsibilities for children or parents. They have financial well-being worries, perhaps because they're dealing with mortgages and lots of payments. We know that they may be in a really tight spot in their career, really doing, high-powered, really doing jobs that require a lot from them as well. So that would really encourage you to think about which groups of people have the lowest well-being, but also the age spectrum as well. And I think the other piece of work that we're doing quite a lot of work on at the moment is about loneliness and social isolation. Our relationships and our positive connections are essential for us to thrive, and having someone to rely on in times of trouble is the biggest difference between high and low well-being nations. So for me, it goes back to that fact that being lonely most or part of the time can have a really detrimental impact on our well-being. There are different types of loneliness, and we've got some research on our website that shows this, and a guide to measuring loneliness as well. There can be social loneliness and emotional loneliness. So emotional loneliness we might get if we've lost a partner through grief and bereavement, or a loss of a close friend or connections. The social loneliness is perhaps when we've maybe moved to a new area, or we've lost the friends and connections and the groups that we get involved with. And there are different interventions that work for different types of loneliness. So it's about listening and working, thinking maybe about how your researcher can help you tailor the evidence of what works around social loneliness, emotional loneliness, and tailor that to the groups that you're working with.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think in our previous discussions, we were talking about how, interventions, even though we're not funding clinical interventions, we do want to see benefits around mental well-being and that relationship, but being aware that, these can have detrimental. We have to really consider and safeguard these kind of these projects, and that's where the partnership can happen. And also just to kind of raise the idea around that, we are really keen to hear from young people leading projects, but also and older people leading projects. But I think a point well made in terms of actually, we want to get a diverse portfolio of our participants across our kind of areas for the Ideas Fund. How about yourself, Sarah Anne? What's happening? What's exciting you?
Thanks, Lewis. I think one of the areas that I think is particularly interesting is around trying to measure the different aspects of well-being that are experienced by individuals. And we've been involved in some work for about 10 years or so in collaboration with Australian colleagues, which is really trying to actually capture the different dimensions of well-being that are talked about within health geography, and these are things around capabilities, integration into social networks, local community, having spaces for wellness where we can recover and engage in kind of therapeutic experiences, and having a sense of security in one's environment and in one's life. And I think one of the things I think is really exciting are the new ways that are emerging to capture these dimensions of well-being and actually map them across space. So we've done that, for example, with some social enterprises and community organisations to collaboratively really try to understand how their spaces and their activities can facilitate positive experiences of well-being for the people that come into contact with them. And I think, like you mentioned, we're still kind of in the midst of the pandemic, and I think there's some really interesting work being done there as well in terms of, what are the impacts on individuals' well-being, but also kind of what are some of the ways in which resilience has been built through community activities and volunteering over the last kind of 12 months or so. So we've been, for example, looking at the use of digital technology and can digital technology support well-being for groups such as people living with long-term conditions or frontline workers within the NHS. So I think, these new ways of using technology and mapping to kind of capture community experience and help them interpret and understand that are really exciting.
Thanks, Sarah. And in fact, it would be really good to get maybe invite you to kind of give another example of that partnership, because I think it's a really good, I know that question's come up about how can researchers work in a way that's not just about researching on the communities. So, I mean, what could you talk a little bit more about that project, the Green Space project in particular? Yeah,
sure. So we carried out a project with a community who were a residential community adjacent to a large green space within Scotland. And the community themselves realised that they maybe weren't using that space to the best of its utility, if you like, to improve their well-being. So that was one of the examples of where we used the mapping technique, and we did that in collaboration with the community members to help them think about what their green space meant to them. And we used it to uncover what the meanings were that people attached to that space, and that was both positive and negative meanings and experiences of the green space. And I think that really helped us to kind of formulate ways to think about how we could improve access to the green space. So that was through both physical access measures, like putting in benches and accessible paths, for example, but also in terms of that social access. So if you like, working with the community to understand, could they shift perceptions that this green space was actually theirs, it was something that they could access, they could own, and they could utilise to improve their own well-being. And some examples of that kind of social access would be local interpretation of the natural area that drew on local residents' memories, for example, of like the year the pond froze and we all went skating, or games that kids had played in the woods and things when they were children. And also like just some of the names that people have for natural features, like the huge tree on the hill. And these are things that are really important to people, and kind of working together to uncover those and tell those stories and share those stories meant that you were then impacting on people's desire to use the green space for well-being. So I think as researchers as well, we were able to bring some tools from community engagement research, which helps the community members to think through and prioritise which types of improvements they might want to take forward as a priority.
Yeah, and I think that's another really clear example, one that we've seen ourselves with you with the Western Isles Library, for example, when we've got a project together looking at, again, how researchers can share those tools to help communities make the sense of the expertise they already have and map that, and use postcards as a way of looking at culture and social isolation. I mean, I know, Joanne, you've got another quite similar example as well. Would you mind sharing that with us briefly?
Yeah, so I think so first I talked about individual well-being, didn't I? And the three things that drive our individual well-being are our health, whether that's physical and mental health, our relationships that I spoke about, and also the work and the activities that we do. When we think about the evidence, what works to improve community well-being, it's slightly different. You can't just add up the well-being of individuals and get community well-being. We know for community well-being, it's around people, places, and power. And one of the things you might want to explore with your researcher is how do those three areas of people, place, and power work for our community and our local area. So for the people piece, it's about having networks of support. It's about feeling trust and belonging. So when you're thinking about your projects, how are you going to design this in? How might your researcher help and suggest and explore how we can design that in? For places, absolutely, as Sarah Ann said, it's about having access, but it's also about shared practices or history or culture, those storytelling. There's some really good evidence around that as well. And finally, for community wellbeing, it's about power. It's about having a voice and a sense of control over the things that are important to you. So one of the projects that we have on our website as a practice example that we can share a link to is some work that the Sheffield environmental movement did. And they'd looked at who was using their green space and realised that their local Black and ethnic minority communities weren't accessing it as much as we'd hoped. And yes, you could look at access, you could look at how far it was to travel and the bus routes, but actually we needed to go beyond that. It wasn't just the objective measures that we could count, the distance and the numbers, it was how it felt to people who wanted to be using that. And one of the things that they found was that actually one of the key barriers was that there weren't Black role models in the environment, working in the environment, volunteering in the environmental, in the local parks as well. So they didn't feel it was a place where they would belong. So again, that belonging piece was really important. And I think the second area that they found in the research when they worked with community leaders was about how people were introduced to the local parks and green spaces. If that came from your parents and through schooling, you were more likely to be engaged. But for people who were moving into the area and were new, those gateways weren't there. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's really important when we're developing our projects to think about what does the evidence say works and how do we tailor that and work with our local communities to make sure we bring the evidence alongside the community need and the community insight.
Thanks, Joanne. And I think that leads us on really nicely to our next segment, because I think we have to be really careful about how we, especially when we are working with more marginalised voices or historically definitely marginalised voices, how we make sure that, that lived experience is also, tempered. And I think when we discussed this before, this idea around there is the evidence, but actually it's more about how we make sure that whose expertise has been valued and how do we bring in trusted community partners and really genuinely listen to them. We are going to have to move on, but I do know for both of you, we have lots and lots of resources that we're going to signpost to from your website. There's lots of toolkits from there, and Sarah Ann, you've got lots of resources that we'll signpost to. And of course, if you're listening and like to ask questions, please do put them in the FAQs, the questions bit, and hopefully we'll get a time to bring Sarah Ann and Joanne back as well. So thank you both of you. Like I said, for our next discussion, what we're going to have is think a little bit about what's the potential for communities and researchers to work together? How can that happen? But with that, what's the responsibility and how can we make sure we go beyond not just inclusion, but that we centre marginalised voices? So I'd like to invite our next panel. We have Lisa Archibald from the Family Voices Forum in Northern Ireland. We have Dr. Emma Jackson from Glasgow Caledonian University, and we have John Beaton from Inclusion Scotland as well. So thank you so much for joining us, everybody. And similar to beforehand, could we start perhaps with a very brief introduction about who you are and your experience of communities and researchers working together? Lisa?
Hi everyone, I'm Lisa Archibald and I coordinate a regional group across Northern Ireland called Families Voices Forum. Now they're all family members who got together quite a while ago wanting to make a difference in suicide prevention and the resulting deaths that happen by suicide across Northern Ireland. They began this work really because they wanted to ensure that other families who were in the same position as them, who may have experienced a bereavement, got better support, increased involvement in processes surrounding that. And healing happens as a result of that involvement. Obviously, the group can't just look at suicide bereavement without looking at the mental health and emotional framework development that supports that. So they also try and work hard to influence the agenda around developing a greater understanding of that towards suicide prevention measures, ultimately, hopefully reducing the amount of suicides we see across the country. So the group do this by taking a collaborative approach to bringing about change, and they sit as equal partners around the table with everybody from the political institutions and government and our assembly through to a variety of statutory organisations, and also through community C&V sector work and development opportunities. And we sit there in those discussions, making decisions and driving change as people with lived experience. And we're seen as experts through that lived experience. And that's a really vital message we want to get across. So our first experience of being involved with research really came around in 2019 when we had a big worldwide research conference about suicide prevention in Derry. Mm-hmm. And we brought together researchers from as far as America, Australia, and throughout Europe to sit and have these discussions. And one of the most critical messages that came across as a result of that was the role of lived experience, and how that needs to become more important when we look at research. We need to define what that is, and we need to have a greater understanding of how we work together as partners, as equals, to be a team, to expand the evidence-based knowledge for changes that are being requested. Mm-hmm. So as a consequence of that, we've developed a Northern Ireland Suicide Prevention Research Network where we work in partnership with Queen's University and the University of Ulster, as well as other key practitioners around the country. Mm-hmm. We sit together regularly and talk about the development of research. And that led us on to becoming involved with a significant research piece last year with the Samaritans, which I'll talk to you a bit more about later, because there was a lot of learning happened, and it's good to share that. And hopefully you'll gain something from our experience.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Lisa. And we'll pick that up very much a little bit later as we go forward. John, do you want to just give us a bit of an introduction as well?
Hi, yeah. My name is John, as Lewis said there. For the visually impaired, I'm a middle-aged man with a bald head, a small goatee beard, blue eyes, and I wear glasses. I currently work for Inclusion Scotland. It's a disabled people's organisation, and I work within the policy and research team. Prior to this, my journey started as a peer activist in the mental health recovery movement, to becoming Highland's first peer support worker, I'm on mute, am I? No, I'm not.
No,
all right. To becoming a peer researcher on, you guessed it, peer support. So that's a lot of peers. So what is a peer? A peer in these contexts is someone who has a sense of shared identity with the community they are campaigning for, supporting, or researching. But more importantly, a peer also means a person of equal status. Establishing relationships that explore that dynamic between academics and communities as equal and alternative sources of knowledge and expertise is vital, really. That sense of empowerment that comes from a meaningful and purposeful role does indeed contribute to your own mental well-being. And for me, those are the strong foundations you need to build successful community research, whether that be a community of geography, interest, experience, or indeed identity.
Thanks very much, John. And then just to bring in Emma to introduce yourself as well.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for this invite. I'm an academic who works with communities who are marginalised because they are racialised, and I've been working with them in Scotland for over 20 years. And I'm really here, I mean, it's mental health, mental well-being is not particularly my area of expertise, although it touches on a lot, because obviously racism impacts hugely on your experiences of mental well-being. But that's not really why I'm here. I'm here because I have spent a long time looking at the system within the academy. I've understood the experiences of communities marginalized, not just because, for example, through ableism, through homophobia, through racism, that understanding the assumptions that the system takes when it engages with research. And so I started off as a kind of researcher who went into this area thinking, oh, research is going to show the objective truth. It's going to be, that's what research is all about. And then the assumptions that I saw, the way that they did, the way that they behave around people who are racialized, who are some, I've got to tell you, of some of the most researched people in society are those who are racialized. And yet the inequalities are huge which surround them. So then I started to think, well, what is on earth is going on here? And so my academic work with communities has been to focus on communities to help them demonstrate to the system how the system behaves around them. So that's what I guess what I bring to this conversation. I have, I think I'll leave that there. So there's lots of experience of working with communities who, I think it's come up a couple of times, actually, I did want to say it in my introduction, the only knowledge that is needed is the people from the communities, whatever community that is the knowledge. And I have been a very challenged academic, because that is not how academia or the academy behaves. It behaves, and I've got to say, all the funders I've ever come across, of course, bar the Ideas Fund, has been a huge challenge to them to even consider that the expertise is with the people. And so I see this as I'm here today because this, to me, is a really important political moment about a challenge to dismantle and disrupt the system that seems to think that someone's going to tell the communities what's knowledge, what's expertise. So I come at it from within the academy, but challenging it. So there we go.
No, thank you so much, Matt. And to be honest, I'm going to, continue on that, because I think it is important that we know that historically in these types of projects, these types of funding, different groups have been ignored, for want of a better word, and excluded. And so I think it is, we are very, very keen in terms of the diversity of our portfolios to make sure that this is an opportunity for those communities to take the lead and to really do that. And so, I mean, you've already touched on it, but, I think what I'm taking from what you're saying and from our conversations before is what is the responsibility around when planning these types of projects for communities who are marginalised? How do we make sure that that we work against systems that might exclude them otherwise?
Well, I think there's a real assumption that, often I work with really fragile community groups who are asked then to participate in research as though the research is, I don't know who's here from the research world, but as though they're doing them a favor to come and join this. And it's huge pressure on the system of community organizing that they have to somehow direct it. And so I say funders should be funding the engagement with the researchers for the community, that if to work out, do they trust these people? Are these people going to come in here, do some damage and leave with the best intention in the world? Of course, I don't mean that they intend that, but unpick, the care that you need to go into these organizations who are trying to do things for the people around them, that live around them, that have experienced the same thing of them. And then for academics to come in and try to assist that, from my perspective, and I'm only learning all this, is that the care you have to show to communities and demonstrate to them that they can trust you with this. Mm-hmm. And so I think that should be funded. So my key thing, that exploration at no cost with tiny application form, do not make me go through masses to just engage. and explore it. And so to me, that is the biggest thing. And then you can work out if you can work with that academic or the researching team, and then the research will grow from what is actually the community wants it to be, which is the point in my head anyway.
100%, and I know we keep stressing that that's why there is a support system, that's why the development coordinators, so that's why there is a process, and we want to make sure that that's always reiterated as well. Now, I am very aware of time, but I'm really valuing this conversation. But I do want to come to John as well, because of course you work with disabled communities who are marginalised as well, and all the sorts of intersections. Why is it important that we centre those voices from your perspective?
I mean, for me, frankly, it's common sense to prioritise the voices of people within our communities facing the highest levels of inequality. And we know that's the marginalised communities and the intersections of those marginalised communities. And people, like communities, are not homogeneous. We have multiple identities. We can be disabled people from a BME background. We can have multiple impairments within the disability community. People are not just the disabled people's community. They're part of the community. So if we truly want to wish how to learn how to improve the overall levels of community well-being, that's what we need to do. I mean, for example, 1 in 3 of disabled people are likely to have a coexisting mental health problem. That's prior to COVID. A problem for a silent mental health crisis and these people's mental well-being. And a problem that from our research at Inclusion Scotland has doubled to 2 in 3 in the Highlands because of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the disabled people's community. But when you're planning to think about your preconceptions about what a marginalised community is, often the terms of community interest and community of experience and identity, they're all used interchangeably. And this is particularly important as the disabled people's community is often described as a community of interest. This is an imaginary community. It doesn't exist unless someone brings it together, develops and supports it. The best way to do this is by bringing people together as a community of experience, of facing similar barriers to their inclusion. The social model of disability says that we're disabled by the barriers we face in society and not by our impairments or our differences. Through identifying as a disabled person in this way, we become a community of identity, and identifying as a disabled person as someone who is disabled by the barriers. And that's a positive identity that makes us part of the solution and not part of the problem. And marginalised communities are often described as hard to reach, and I prefer to think about them as easy to ignore. I think a lot of people don't engage with marginalised communities because they're afraid of getting it wrong. The best way to deal with this anxiety is to reach out and invite people to have those conversations and actively listen to how to anticipate everybody's needs. And that's listening with the intent to understand, not to respond. Once you've identified the need, you can address it, which is at the heart of inclusion. And more importantly, be willing to be humble enough to apologise if you get it wrong and commit to getting it right in the future. No one, and I mean no one, is an expert at this. I've been doing this for over 10 years and I'm still learning every day from everyone. So to summarise, the best way to design your project is to ask yourselves a simple question. Who am I willing to exclude? And if the answer is no one, and you want to leave no one behind, you can begin designing your project inclusively.
Okay. Thanks very much, John. I'm just, Iman, did you want to feed in there? Because I think I saw your hand. We do have to, I think what we'll do next is we'll just kind of, I know there's kind of, we have to go to the final kind of reflections because I do want to make sure there's a bit of time for a little bit of questioning. So Lisa, just to kind of give you a little bit of an advance warning, just to kind of, if you can, I know there's a lot of insight and we'll share some of that in the summaries as well. But if you could have a little think about kind of last reflection for people who are listening. But Ima.
All right, this will be my last reflection, I guess, as well as the comment. But I think it's about who the researchers are. I mean, I want the community to see their power, it's them. They have the knowledge, they have the expertise. And so that the researchers who come to them should reflect the issues that they're wanting to have researched to some extent. And that I think that the whole dynamic around both who is the researcher and what's allowed to be a researcher. And I think that we have to look at this really seriously. And that's why I think that the funding, which comes before the research even started, this funding for the people who the research is about, and as I say, marginalized people are some of the most, and I don't just mean racialized people, I mean whatever thing you have away from the norm is some of the most researched. So the researchers are clever, they're getting cleverer around this kind of issue, and to just, so I think this fund is really helpful to help try and understand some of that and help communities understand, you know, the risks of engaging with research as much as, and what to look for in a researcher that's trying to at least navigate and understand some of that for them, with them, and out of that get some validation, I guess, of their own experiences towards the research. I think I'll leave that there. That's my last point.
Thank you. And I think, again, you know, it's a learning process. It very much is that, you know, is relationship supporting. That's one of the key outcomes that we want from it. We'll go with Lisa and then we'll finish with John.
Just reflecting on what Emma and John have both said, really, the group of people I work with would be considered hard to reach. There is no hard to reach people out there. It's about understanding how we communicate, how we work together, how we work with power differentials, and how we do that with safety and security of both the researchers, the groups, and the participants involved. And that needs to be a team effort, a collaborative, co-produced, co-designed effort, because we know when experts design services, design changes, design improvements, and they wonder why then the community doesn't engage. And the reason they don't engage is they haven't been involved properly. So involving people in a variety of ways is just critical to the success of your project. If you want to see the most impact on what you're doing, you need to get that involvement right from the start.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Lisa. Okay. And then John?
Yeah, just to echo something Lisa was talking about, getting it right at the start, and co-production means involving people in decision-making from the beginning, not in the middle or at the end. But build trust, which is something that Emma talked about, and this is something I'm usually passionate about. And the best way to do that is by sharing your values. Talk about your values first in any conversation, and all conversations you have with researchers or your community. We mostly share the same values. You know, we're human beings, you know, but some of us, we value those differently at different times in different ways. And that's where you start getting into being a little bit more culturally sensitive about who you're engaging with. Discussing those similarities and differences early will save a lot of energy and a lot of time later on. It'll also help you establish shared beliefs about the way you will operate the project between you and the researchers, and promote well-considered joint decision-making. And finally, it sounds obvious, but you don't know what you don't know. Don't assume that you don't already have research expertise in the community, and don't assume researchers don't already have experience of engaging with communities. Do a skills audit, work out what you already have to build on. It's really the best way to start respecting each other's experience and expertise as equal and alternative sources of knowledge. This advice will hopefully set you off to a good start, building a new community and a community of learning.
Thanks very much, John. I think there's some interesting words and advice in there in terms of, and you know, like you say, ultimately it's all about discussions. It's all about having conversations and making sure you build in from the very beginning these types of things. And it's something we're going to encourage people to reflect on. After this session, we will have to close it here, but also thinking about in the next session about what types of things that you might want to ask practically as these relationships are being built. So I want to say a massive thank you to Lisa, to Emma, and to John for joining us. We will we'll pass over to Chris to kind of bring things over, I think, and see how we are for time. But thank you again, Lisa, Emma, and John.
Thank you to everyone. I don't know if we can do a virtual round of applause or a real round of applause, but that was really fascinating and great to hear that hopefully the approach of the Ideas Fund can help to address some of this imbalance that we've been hearing about in terms of the value of knowledge. We've tried to answer as many questions as possible through the Q&A on the text box. I know there are a couple remaining, but unfortunately we do have to draw to a close now. So we will respond to those in writing and share those answers out. Just before I share the final slide, be really helpful, as we did last time, to just get a bit of feedback on this webinar and what future areas might be helpful for attendees. So briefly then, just a reminder of what the next steps are. So the recorded version of this webinar will be available from early next week, again through the British Science Association YouTube channel and also on the Ideas Fund website. We'll send out the Q&A that we had last time along with that recording and links, so that it's all in one place for you. If you haven't already, you can note down the details of the next workshops. Please just mark them in your diary for now. We're just setting up the links for you to register for those. So those links will be sent out next week as well. As before, all of the contact details, including the development coordinators and us at the BSA, are on the slide as well. So please do get in touch. And that's just to say thank you once again for your time, to our captioners, tech support, our interpreters, as well as our speakers. I'd just like to ask everyone once again to turn their cameras on at the very end for a farewell wave. We'll send out lots of links and share a lot of the stuff that's been discussed in one go next week. So thank you very much. Any feedback or thoughts or anything, please do let us know. If not, we'll give you a wave to say goodbye for now and see you next time. Thank you, everyone.